A racist cop crushes a disabled black woman over her tattoos until he learns who her husband is. Amelia, a disabled black mother, was walking with her son when a police officer stopped her, targeting her for nothing more than the tattoos on her arms. What started as a routine encounter spiraled into cruelty, with the officer pushing her to the ground. But when her husband arrived, carrying a connection that none of them could have predicted, the tables turned in a way no one expected. Have you ever faced or seen someone face such blatant prejudice? How did it feel? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. The quiet of the evening was pierced by the sound of heavy boots against the pavement. Amelia Jackson, a black single mother walking with the aid of a cane, strolled cautiously through her neighborhood. Her 6-year-old son, Ethan, clutched her free hand, his small fingers gripping tightly as they moved toward their modest apartment. The distant hum of passing cars was the only other sound until a sharp voice cut through the air. "Ma'am, stop right there," a man commanded. Amelia froze mid-step, her heart racing as she turned to see Officer Jake Peterson approaching. His expression was stony, his eyes scanning her with an intensity that made her uneasy. Jake, a middle-aged officer with a reputation for being uncompromising, moved with an air of authority that left no room for negotiation. "ID now," he barked, his tone curt and impersonal. Amelia shifted her weight onto her good leg, her grip tightening around Ethan's hand. "What's the problem, officer?" she asked, her voice calm but steady. She wasn't new to interactions like this, but she hated how familiar the script had become. "You're in an area where we've had some reports of suspicious activity," Jake replied coldly. "Show me your ID." Amelia frowned. "I live here. This is my neighborhood. What's this about?" Jake ignored her response and gestured to her bag. "I'm going to need to search that," he said, his voice low but sharp. Amelia's jaw tightened. "That won't be necessary. I haven't done anything wrong." Ethan tugged at her sleeve, his eyes wide with confusion. "Mommy, what's happening?" he whispered. "It's okay, baby," Amelia said softly, her eyes not leaving Jake. "Everything's fine." Jake stepped closer, his towering frame looming over them. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Hand over the bag." Amelia held her ground, her voice firm. "No, you don't have a reason to search my belongings." Jake's face hardened. "Are you resisting, ma'am? Because I can make this official real quick." Before she could respond, Jake reached for her bag, his movements deliberate and forceful. Amelia jerked it back, her voice rising. "Don't touch me! You're out of line!" Her raised voice caught the attention of a few passers-by, who began to slow their pace, their phones discreetly angled to record. The tension crackled in the air as Jake squared his shoulders, ignoring the growing audience. "Listen," Jake said through gritted teeth. "I don't care what you think you're entitled to. I'm asking you to comply, and I'm telling you, I have nothing to hide, but you have no right to treat me like this." Amelia shot back, her eyes blazing. "Do your job the right way," Ethan whimpered, burying his face against her side. "Mommy, I'm scared." Amelia crouched slightly to comfort him, her voice softer but no less resolute. "I know, baby. It's going to be okay." Jake's patience was wearing thin. He glanced at the onlookers, some of whom were now openly filming. "You think they're going to save you?" he sneered. "Let's not make a scene for your kids' sake." "You're the one creating the scene," Amelia countered. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. She couldn't afford to let this escalate, not with Ethan here, but she also refused to be bullied. Jake stepped closer, his hand brushing the radio on his shoulder. "I'll call for backup if I need to," he warned. "You really want this to go further?" Amelia's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to break eye contact. "Do what you have to do, but I won't let you humiliate me in front of my son." Jake's scowl deepened. "You people are all the same," he muttered under his breath, the words laced with contempt. Amelia's eyes widened at the remark, her blood boiling. "Excuse me? What did you just say?" Jake didn't answer, but his sneer spoke volumes. The silent accusation in his expression said everything Amelia needed to know. This wasn't about enforcing the law. This was personal. The crowd grew larger, murmurs of discontent rippling through the group. A woman called out, "Leave her alone. She didn't do anything." Jake's hand hovered near his sidearm, his posture tense. "Stay back," he barked to the growing spectators. "Mommy," Ethan whispered again, his voice trembling. "I'm here, Ethan," she said, forcing calm into her tone. "I won't let anything happen to you." Jake took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Last chance. Hand over the bag." Amelia didn't flinch. "And I told you, no, you're not laying a hand on me or my things." The standoff reached its breaking point. Jake's hand shot out toward her shoulder, gripping it tightly as he tried to wrest the bag from her grasp. Amelia cried out, stumbling slightly, but refusing to let go. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice cracking with both fear and fury. "You're hurting me!" The crowd erupted, voices rising in protest. Phones flashed as more people began recording, their outrage spilling over. "Let her go!" someone yelled. "You're out of control, man!" shouted another. Jake's colleague, Officer Ryan Carter, arrived on the scene, his face immediately registering the chaos. "What's going on here?" he demanded, stepping between Jake and Amelia. "She's resisting," Jake snapped, his grip on Amelia's shoulder tightening momentarily before he released her. "I'm handling it." Ryan's eyes darted to Amelia, who was clutching Ethan tightly, her face a mixture of fear and defiance. "This doesn't look like handling it," Ryan said sharply. "You need to back off." Jake glared at Ryan, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't tell me how to do my job." "I will if you're stepping out of line," Ryan shot back. "Look around, Jake. This isn't going to end well for you." The two men locked eyes, the tension between them almost as palpable as the hostility in the crowd. Amelia took the opportunity to steady herself, her grip on Ethan unwavering. "You okay, ma'am?" Ryan asked, his voice gentler now. Amelia nodded stiffly. "I just want to get my son home." Ryan turned to Jake, his tone firm. "Let her go. She's not a threat." Jake hesitated, his jaw tightening as he scanned the crowd. The growing number of witnesses, combined with Ryan's intervention, left him with little choice. Finally, he stepped back, though his glare remained fixed on Amelia. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Amelia didn't respond. She straightened her shoulders, and with Ethan clinging to her side, began to walk away. The crowd parted to let her pass, murmurs of support following in her wake. As she disappeared into the night, Ryan turned to Jake, his expression unreadable. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded. Jake didn't answer. Instead, he turned on his heel and stalked away, the tension still simmering in the humid night air. The scene near the street corner was chaotic, tension hanging heavy in the humid air. Officer Ryan Carter, a younger officer with a clean record and a reputation for level-headedness, arrived to a chorus of raised voices and flashing phone cameras. His sharp eyes immediately landed on Officer Jake Peterson, whose rigid posture and clenched jaw revealed the turmoil brewing within him. "What the hell's going on here, Jake?" Ryan demanded, his tone cutting through the noise. Jake barely spared him a glance, his hand still hovering near his radio. "Handling business," he said gruffly. Ryan's gaze flicked to Amelia, who stood protectively in front of her son, her expression one of barely restrained fury. Ethan clung to her leg, his small frame trembling as he buried his face against her side. "This doesn't look like handling business," Ryan countered, stepping closer. His voice lowered, sharp with urgency. "You're escalating the situation. Back off." Jake turned, his glare like a whip crack. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job, rookie." Ryan bristled at the insult, but refused to back down. "This isn't about your job. It's about keeping things from spinning out of control." Jake scoffed, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer to Ryan. "Don't get in my way. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Ryan refused to be intimidated, his voice steady. "What I see is a mother trying to protect her kid, and you pushing her to the edge. This is not how we do things." The words landed like a slap, but Jake didn't falter. "You've been here 5 minutes, and you think you're some authority on protocol?" he sneered. "You don't know what it's like to do this job the right way." Ryan's patience snapped. "The right way doesn't involve manhandling a woman in front of her kid. Do you even hear yourself?" Jake's face darkened, and for a moment, it seemed he might lunge at Ryan. Instead, he turned sharply toward Amelia. "I'm not done here," he growled, brushing past Ryan and closing the distance between him and Amelia. Amelia straightened, her chin lifting defiantly. "You've already done enough." Jake's expression twisted with irritation. "I'm not taking orders from you," he spat, reaching out and shoving her shoulder. Amelia stumbled, barely managing to keep her balance as Ethan let out a frightened cry. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice trembling with both anger and fear. The small crowd that had gathered erupted in outrage. "Hey, back off!" a man shouted, his phone aimed directly at Jake. "What's wrong with you?" another voice called out. The murmurs grew louder, the crowd pressing in slightly, their frustration spilling over. Ryan moved quickly, placing himself between Jake and Amelia. "Enough!" he barked, his tone commanding. He turned to Jake, his eyes blazing. "What the hell is wrong with you? She's not a threat, Jake. She's resisting." Jake snapped back, his voice rising. She's protecting herself, Ryan shot back, his voice cracking with disbelief. You're out of line and you know it, Jake sneered, his lip curling. You don't get it. This isn't about her. It's about maintaining control. No, it's about abuse of power, Ryan countered, his voice sharp and unyielding. You're making this worse for all of us. Jake's hand flexed near his utility belt, his knuckles white against his skin. You don't know the first thing about being in charge. So how about you shut up and step aside before you make things worse? Ryan squared his shoulders, refusing to back down. If anyone's making things worse, it's you. Look around, Jake. The cameras are rolling. You're putting a target on your back and on this department. For the first time, Jake faltered. His gaze flicked to the crowd, their phones capturing every second of the exchange. His breathing quickened as the weight of the moment began to settle over him. A voice from the crowd rang out. What's his badge number? Another person shouted. We need to report this. Jake's face twisted into a mask of frustration. You people have no idea what you're talking about, he muttered, loud enough for the onlookers to hear. The crowd surged closer, their murmurs turning into a chorus of demands. Let her go! This is harassment! We're sending this to the media! Amelia, her voice clear despite her shaking hands, spoke up. You're on notice now, Officer Peterson. Everything you're doing is being recorded. Jake's jaw clenched, the veins in his neck standing out. He took a step back, his composure fraying under the pressure. Ryan seized the moment, placing a hand on Jake's arm and pulling him aside. Stand down, Jake, Ryan said, his voice low and urgent. Before this blows up in your face. Jake shook him off roughly, his breathing labored. Don't tell me what to do, Carter. I'm telling you because someone has to, Ryan hissed, his tone cutting. We're supposed to protect people, not terrorize them. Jake glared at him, his eyes filled with unspoken rage, but he didn't push forward. The weight of the phones pointed at him, the rising anger of the crowd, and Ryan's unrelenting stance left him with no good options. Finally, he stepped back, his hands raised slightly in a mockery of surrender. Fine, he spat. But this isn't over. Ryan didn't flinch. It's over if I say it is. Jake stalked away, the tension in his posture visible in every step. The crowd's murmurs followed him, their anger simmering but not yet boiling over. Amelia clutched Ethan tightly, her knuckles white against the strap of her bag. Ryan turned to her, his expression softening. Are you okay, ma'am? Amelia nodded, though her eyes shone with unshed tears. I just want to get home, she said quietly, her voice tight. Ryan glanced at the crowd, then back at Amelia. Let me walk you to your door, he offered, just to make sure. She hesitated, then nodded. As they began to walk, the crowd slowly began to disperse, their attention lingering on Jake as he retreated into the night. The air felt heavy with unresolved tension, the promise of more conflict hanging just out of reach. The incident left fractures within the department and raised questions among the public. Jake's unyielding actions and Ryan's defiance would set the stage for a deeper battle, one that would force loyalties and convictions to the surface. Amelia clutched Ethan tightly as she tried to shield him from the tension boiling over. Officer Ryan Carter had managed to calm the situation briefly, but Jake Peterson's hostility was far from extinguished. His eyes flickered with frustration as he paced nearby, his hand hovering near his holster. From down the street, the low rumble of an engine broke through the murmurs of the crowd. A black pickup truck pulled to an abrupt stop, and Marcus Bennett stepped out, his face etched with confusion and rising anger. He had been on his way home from work when he saw the commotion, and then his wife and son in the middle of it. Amelia! Marcus called, his deep voice carrying over the din. He strode toward her with purposeful urgency, his protective instincts kicking in. Ethan's tear-streaked face sent a pang of fury through him. Marcus, no, Amelia said, her voice trembling. It's under control. Just go. Jake's head snapped toward the approaching man, his jaw tightening. Stay back, Jake barked, raising a hand to halt Marcus in his tracks. This is a police matter. You need to leave. Marcus stopped short, his hands balling into fists at his sides. That's my wife and son. What the hell is going on here? His tone was sharp, his body taut with restrained anger. I said, back off, Jake repeated, his voice louder. You're interfering with an active situation. Walk away now, or I'll have you removed. Marcus squared his shoulders and took another step closer, defying Jake's order. Removed? For what? Being here for my family? His voice dripped with incredulity. You think you can bully her because you've got a badge? Jake's expression darkened, his authority feeling challenged. You're escalating this situation. Don't make me put you in cuffs. Ryan interjected, stepping between the two men. "Jake, that's enough," he said firmly, his tone cutting through the escalating tension. "This is already out of hand. Let's just de-escalate." "De-escalate?" Jake snapped, his glare shifting to Ryan. "This guy is refusing a lawful order. He's pushing his luck." Marcus pointed a finger at Jake. "You're the one out of line. I saw you shove her. You think we're just going to stand here and take this?" Jake moved to close the gap between them, his hand brushing against his belt where his handcuffs hung. "That's it," he growled. "You're under arrest." Marcus took a deliberate step back, raising his hands slightly, though his voice remained defiant. "For what? Standing on a public street. You're going to arrest me for protecting my family?" The crowd, which had grown larger as the confrontation unfolded, began shouting in protest. "This is wrong," one voice cried. "Leave him alone," yelled another. Phones pointed toward the scene, their screens glowing in the fading light. Jake lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by the arm. Marcus twisted instinctively, pulling free. "Don't touch me," he snapped, his voice sharp with warning. Jake's patience snapped. He reached for his radio, his other hand going for Marcus again. "You're resisting. Get your hands off me." Marcus barked, shoving Jake's arm away with a forceful swipe. The two men stood inches apart, their heated breaths mingling in the tense space between them. Ethan's frightened cry pierced the air as Amelia clutched him tighter, her voice breaking. "Marcus, please stop," she begged, tears streaking her face. Jake's grip on Marcus tightened, but before he could wrestle him to the ground, Marcus braced his feet and pushed back. The two men locked in a brief but intense physical struggle, grappling as the crowd roared in protest. Ryan stepped in, trying to separate them. "That's enough," Ryan shouted, shoving himself between Jake and Marcus. "Jake, stop this now." "You're making a scene!" Jake was breathing hard, his face red with exertion and anger. "He's under arrest for obstruction and assault," he barked, his voice hoarse. Ryan turned on him, his frustration boiling over. "The only one assaulting anyone here is you. Look at what you're doing." Jake's face twisted in defiance, but he hesitated. The voices from the crowd grew louder, the outrage palpable. "This is police brutality," someone yelled. "We've got it all on camera." Marcus, chest heaving, locked eyes with Jake. His voice was low, steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "You think this ends here?" he said. "I've got proof of what you're doing, and I'm not going anywhere." Jake sneered, his authority crumbling under the weight of the public's scrutiny. "We'll see about that," he spat, yanking his radio to call for backup. "One move, and you're spending the night in a cell." Before Marcus could respond, Ryan grabbed Jake's arm, his voice urgent. "Enough, Jake. Back off before this blows up in our faces." Jake yanked his arm free and glared at Ryan. "Stay out of this, Carter. You don't tell me how to do my job." Amelia stepped forward, her voice shaking but loud enough to cut through the noise. "He didn't do anything wrong," she shouted. "This isn't justice. It's harassment." The crowd erupted again, their shouts reaching a fever pitch. "Let him go. Do your job right." The cacophony was deafening. Jake pulled out his cuffs and stepped toward Marcus, but Ryan blocked his path, his hand raised. "No, not like this," he said firmly. "Get out of my way," Jake hissed, his voice venomous. Ryan didn't budge. "I can't let you take this any further." "It's over, Jake." Jake's hand hovered over the cuffs, his indecision playing out in the tension of his posture. The crowd's demands and Ryan's unwavering stance finally wore him down. With a frustrated growl, he stepped back. "This isn't over," Jake said through gritted teeth. He turned sharply, pushing his way through the throng of people. The crowd parted reluctantly, their anger following him as he disappeared into the night. Amelia collapsed into Marcus's arms, her sobs muffled against his chest. Ethan clung to both of them, his small body trembling. Ryan stood nearby, his gaze heavy with regret. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Marcus looked up, his eyes blazing with determination. "No, but we will be." The tension in the air was electric, with the crowd murmuring in anger and disbelief as Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow. His gaze locked onto Amelia, who was clutching Ethan tightly, tears streaming down her face. Jake Peterson loomed nearby, his hand still on his radio, ready to call for backup if Marcus made another move. Marcus raised his voice, cutting through the chaos. "You think this ends here, Jake? You're wrong. I've got proof, documents, videos, everything showing what you and others in your department have been doing." Jake froze mid-motion, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell are you talking about?" he barked, his tone a mix of irritation and unease. "You know exactly what I mean," Marcus shot back. "Your abuse of power, the discrimination, the cover-ups. I've been gathering evidence for months, and I'm not the only one. This isn't just about tonight. It's about every time you've crossed the line and gotten away with it. The crowd, already riled up, grew louder. People began shouting questions, demanding answers. "What kind of evidence?" one man yelled. "Why hasn't anything been done?" Others took up the chant. "We want the truth. We want justice." Jake's jaw clenched as he turned to Marcus, his voice low and threatening. "You're bluffing. If you had anything, you wouldn't be out here running your mouth. You're just trying to make noise. Try me," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "Because if anything happens to me tonight, everything I have will go public. Every video, every name. You think you're untouchable? Think again." Amelia's voice broke through the clamor, sharp and pleading. "No, Marcus, stop this." Her sobs racked her body as she stumbled forward, reaching for him. "Don't provoke him. Please don't make this worse." Jake took a menacing step toward Marcus, ignoring Amelia's cries. "You're walking a fine line, Bennett. You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing but a loudmouth with no respect for authority." Marcus stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. "Authority doesn't mean abuse," he shot back. "It doesn't give you the right to terrorize people like my wife. You've been using that badge to hurt, not protect. And I'm done letting it happen." Ryan Carter, who had been standing silently on the sidelines, shifted uncomfortably. The weight of the moment pressed on him as he glanced between Jake and Marcus. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their silent judgment cutting deep. His training told him to back his partner no matter what, but his conscience screamed at him to act. "Jake," Ryan said finally, his voice tentative. "Maybe we should listen to what he's saying." Jake whirled on him, his face a mask of fury. "Are you serious right now? He's trying to stir up a mob." "Don't fall for it, Carter." Ryan hesitated, his eyes darting to Amelia and Ethan, then back to Marcus. He could see the truth in their faces, the desperation, the raw pain. What if he's not stirring up a mob? What if he's telling the truth? Ryan's voice grew firmer, his own frustration starting to seep through. "We're supposed to stand for justice, not silence people when it's inconvenient." Jake's glare burned hotter. "You need to fall in line, Carter, right now. Don't make me question your loyalty." Amelia suddenly lunged forward, trying to reach Marcus. "You can't take him," she screamed, her voice cracking. "He's done nothing wrong." Jake intercepted her, roughly shoving her back. The crowd gasped as Amelia stumbled, barely keeping her balance. Ethan wailed, his small hands clutching at her skirt as she pulled him close again. "You're out of control!" someone shouted from the crowd. More phones went up, capturing every second of the unfolding chaos. Ryan stepped closer to Jake, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "This is wrong, Jake. Look around. Everyone's watching, and you're only making it worse." Jake spun toward him, his voice a hiss. "You don't know what you're talking about, kid. You think you're going to come in here and play savior. Stay in your lane, or I'll make sure you regret it." The two officers locked eyes, the tension between them palpable. Ryan's heart pounded as he weighed his options. Standing up to Jake could end his career, but staying silent felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in. Meanwhile, Marcus, undeterred by the chaos, raised his voice again. "To everyone here, what's happening right now isn't new. It's been going on for years. People like Jake think they can get away with it because no one stands up to them. Well, I'm standing up, and I'll make sure the truth comes out." The crowd erupted into cheers and shouts of encouragement, their anger fueling Marcus's resolve. Jake's face twisted with frustration, his authority slipping further with every passing moment. Amelia clung to Marcus's arm, her tear-streaked face full of fear. "Please, Marcus, just let it go," she begged. "They'll come after you. They'll come after us." Marcus turned to her, his expression softening for a moment. "I can't, Amelia," he said quietly. "If I don't fight this, it'll never stop. Not for you, not for Ethan, not for anyone." Jake grabbed Marcus by the arm, yanking him backward. "That's enough out of you. You're coming with me," he snapped, pulling out his cuffs. The crowd roared in protest, their voices a wave of defiance. "Leave him alone! This is abuse of power! We're recording everything!" Ryan stepped forward again, his face pale but determined. "Jake, stop. This isn't the way. Back off, Carter, Jake barked. I'm handling this. No, Ryan replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. You're making it worse. We need to step back before this gets out of control. Jake glared at him, but for the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. The crowd's anger was growing louder, their chants of justice echoing through the street. Fine, Jake growled finally, releasing Marcus with a shove. But don't think this is over. You're on borrowed time, Bennett. The crowd cheered as Marcus steadied himself, wrapping an arm protectively around Amelia and Ethan. Ryan stepped back, his expression conflicted as he watched Jake storm away. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then Marcus turned to Amelia, his voice low but firm. I'm not stopping until this is exposed. The truth will come out. Amelia nodded, though her eyes were still filled with worry. Ryan lingered nearby, his conscience warring with his duty. He knew this wasn't the last he would see of Marcus, or of Jake's unchecked aggression. The fluorescent lights of the precinct hummed softly, barely masking the tension that crackled in the air. Officers gathered in clusters, their conversations hushed, but their expressions sharp with judgment. Jake Peterson strode into the briefing room, his face set in a hardened scowl. He could feel the weight of their stares. The whispers stopped when Ryan Carter stepped into the room behind him. Peterson, a senior officer, Lieutenant Roberts, called out from the head of the room. We need to talk about what happened tonight. Jake moved to the center of the room, his shoulders squared. What's there to talk about? He asked, his tone defiant. I handled a hostile situation. End of story. Ryan's voice cut through the silence. That's not what happened, and you know it. The room tensed. Jake turned to Ryan, his jaw tight. Careful, Carter. You're treading on thin ice. Ryan ignored the warning. You shoved an unarmed woman and her kid, Jake. The crowd was ready to riot because of how you escalated the situation. If you can't see that, then maybe you shouldn't be wearing that badge. Murmurs rippled through the room, a mix of agreement and disapproval. Lieutenant Roberts raised a hand to silence the chatter. Enough. Peterson, Carter, sit down. Jake sat, but his glare remained fixed on Ryan. This is nothing but a witch hunt, Jake muttered, crossing his arms. I did what I had to do to control the situation. Roberts leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. You're not the one under attack here, Peterson. But your actions tonight have put this entire department under scrutiny. Videos of the incident are already circulating online. The public is demanding answers. Another officer, Martinez, chimed in. I've seen the footage. It doesn't look good, Jake. That family didn't deserve what you did to them. Jake's fists clenched on the table. You're all so quick to judge, but you weren't there. That man, Marcus Bennett, was trying to rile up the crowd. He's not some innocent victim. Even if he wasn't, Ryan shot back. Your job is to de-escalate, not make things worse. De-escalate? Jake laughed bitterly. Spare me the rookie lecture, Carter. You've been on the force for, 2 years. You don't know what it's like out there. Ryan slammed a hand on the table, rising from his chair. What I know is that you crossed a line. You didn't just hurt that woman. You made us all look like bullies in uniform. Enough, Roberts barked, his voice cutting through the argument. He looked between the two men, his expression grim. This ends here. Both of you out. Ryan stood for a moment longer, his chest heaving, before storming out of the room. Jake stayed behind, his shoulders rigid with anger. Roberts fixed him with a hard stare. Peterson, you need to start asking yourself if the way you handle things is helping or hurting this department. As Jake left the room, muttering under his breath, he found himself stopped by Officer Miller, a veteran officer known for keeping his hands clean in public, but maintaining a reputation for looking the other way in private. Jake, Miller said, his tone measured, we need to talk. Jake sighed. Not now, Miller. I've got enough on my plate. This can't wait, Miller insisted, lowering his voice. You're drawing too much heat. You know as well as I do that there are things in this department that don't need the public's eyes on them. Jake stopped, his brow furrowing. What's that supposed to mean? Miller leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. It means if you keep making noise, you're going to bring the wrong kind of attention. There are people who don't want questions being asked. About tonight, about Bennett, about anything. Jake's jaw tightened. You think I don't know how this works? I'm not some naive rookie. Then act like it, Miller snapped. Because right now, you're a liability. And liabilities don't last long around here. Jake stared at him, the weight of the warning sinking in. Is that a threat? Miller smiled thinly. It's advice. Jake watched him walk away, a knot forming in his stomach. He had always known there were unspoken rules in the department. Lines no one crossed, questions no one asked. But tonight, those rules were suffocating him. He headed to his desk, but the whispers in the bullpen didn't stop. He caught fragments of conversations as he passed. Couldn't control himself. If the captain sees this, it'll be bad. Carter's not wrong. Every word felt like a stone in his gut. Sitting down, Jake pulled out his phone and scrolled through the messages he had received since the incident. His inbox was flooded with emails from superiors, inquiries from reporters, and messages from anonymous senders warning him to keep his head down. One, in particular, stood out. Protect the shield, or you'll regret it. He slammed the phone down on his desk, frustration boiling over. For the first time, he wasn't sure who his allies were, or if he had any left. Ryan's words echoed in his mind. Your job is to de-escalate. But the images of Marcus and Amelia haunted him, forcing him to confront a truth he had been avoiding. Was he really protecting the community, or just his authority? He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. The precinct's hum seemed louder than usual, every sound grating on his nerves. Jake had always prided himself on being a no-nonsense cop, but now, even he wasn't sure if that was an asset or a flaw. When Roberts called him into his office later, the look on the lieutenant's face said it all. Jake, he began, you've got a decision to make. This isn't going to blow over. You're either with us or you're against us. What's that supposed to mean? Jake asked, his voice flat. It means there's a storm coming. If you keep acting like a lone wolf, you're going to get caught in the middle. Jake stood, his fists clenched at his sides. So what? I'm supposed to just ignore what's happening out there? Robert's expression didn't change. I'm saying you need to think carefully about your next move. As Jake left the office, his mind swirled with conflicting thoughts. He had spent years believing in the system, but now he could feel it cracking around him. Was it the system he had been protecting, or just the people willing to exploit it? The tension in the precinct was a palpable thing, growing heavier with every passing hour. Jake knew he was running out of time to decide where he stood. The pressures from his colleagues, the public, and his own conscience were closing in, threatening to crush him under their weight. With mounting pressure from both sides, Jake begins to understand that the very system he's upheld is now turning on him. The question remains, will he defend it, or risk everything to expose the truth? Jake Peterson sat alone in his dimly lit office, the precinct quiet except for the hum of machinery in the background. The envelope in his hands felt heavier than it should, its contents promising answers he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He tore it open with a mix of reluctance and urgency, the name on the first page hitting him like a blow, Marcus Bennett. His eyes scanned the document. At first it was routine, a summary of Marcus's personal details and public record. But then came a name he hadn't thought about in years. Elijah Monroe. Jake froze. Elijah Monroe had been his mentor, a towering figure of integrity in his early years on the force. Elijah had taught Jake everything: how to investigate thoroughly, how to treat people with dignity, and most importantly, how to stand up to injustice. Jake's stomach churned as he read on, the words forming a bridge between Marcus and the man he had once admired. Marcus Bennett was Elijah's son. The revelation struck him harder than he thought possible. Memories of Elijah flooded his mind, unbidden and sharp, like reopened wounds. He saw Elijah's steady gaze, heard his voice full of conviction. Elijah had been everything Jake wasn't: calm, patient, and unflinchingly moral. And Jake had walked away from him. Years ago, Jake had been a young officer with ambition but little direction. Elijah had taken him under his wing, showing him how to temper authority with fairness. But their relationship soured during a pivotal moment in Jake's career. It had been a routine arrest, nothing remarkable on the surface. But Elijah had objected to how Jake handled it, accusing him of using unnecessary force. "What are you doing, Jake?" Elijah had demanded, his voice low but firm as they stood in the precinct locker room. "I'm doing my job," Jake had snapped, his tone defensive. The guy was resisting. Elijah shook his head. "No, he was scared. And you treated him like a threat just because he didn't fit the image you wanted to see. That's not justice." Jake had scoffed, brushing past him. "You don't get it, Elijah. It's not the same out there anymore. You can't coddle people and expect them to respect you." Elijah's voice turned cold. "Respect is earned, Jake. And what you're doing isn't earning anything but fear." The argument had spiraled from there, ending with Elijah's quiet disappointment. "I thought I was teaching you to be better than this," he had said before walking away. That was the last meaningful conversation they'd ever had. Now, years later, Jake couldn't shake the memory. He had convinced himself Elijah's ideals were outdated, that the world had hardened too much for such principles. But seeing Marcus's name linked to Elijah's reopened everything. The son of his former mentor had been the man Jake had humiliated in the street. Jake stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. He paced the small room, his breathing heavy. "What the hell have I done?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how far he'd strayed from everything Elijah had taught him. He'd mocked fairness as weakness, wielded his badge like a weapon, and now he'd harmed the very family of the man who had once trusted him to do better. Jake's phone buzzed on his desk, the screen lighting up with a text from an unknown number. How does it feel to let him down? His blood ran cold. Someone else knew. But who? And how much? He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to sit back down. His mind raced with fragmented thoughts. The confrontation with Marcus, the way Amelia had shielded their son, and Elijah's voice from years ago, telling him to choose the harder right over the easier wrong. He flipped through the file again, desperate for more clarity. Among the documents, he found a photo of Elijah holding a young Marcus on his lap. The boy's wide smile was unmistakable, the resemblance to the man Jake had arrested hauntingly clear. The weight of his betrayal hit him fully. He had not only failed Elijah's legacy, but had actively harmed it. Everything Elijah stood for, justice, compassion, accountability, Jake had trampled in his pursuit of authority. And now, Elijah wasn't here to see how far Jake had fallen. Jake slammed the file shut, his frustration boiling over. He had spent years justifying his actions, telling himself that the ends always justified the means. But the evidence in front of him proved otherwise. He wasn't the protector he had imagined himself to be. He was the oppressor Elijah had warned him about. For the first time in years, Jake felt something crack inside him. It wasn't just guilt. It was the realization that he had built his entire identity on a lie. The badge he wore didn't make him honorable. His choices did. And lately, those choices had been nothing but destructive. His thoughts turned to Marcus and the confrontation in the street. The anger in Marcus's voice wasn't just frustration. It was righteous fury, the kind Jake now recognized from Elijah. Marcus hadn't been trying to provoke him. He had been defending his family, just as Elijah had always defended those who couldn't fight for themselves. Jake leaned forward, his head in his hands. He couldn't undo what he had done to Marcus and Amelia, but he could stop it from getting worse. The documents Marcus mentioned, whatever they contained, might hold the key to exposing a deeper rot within the department. But doing so would mean turning on everything he had spent his career protecting. He thought about Elijah again, wondering what the man would say if he were alive. He could almost hear the answer, clear and steady in his mind. "Do the right thing, Jake, even if it costs you." Taking a deep breath, Jake reached for his phone. He hesitated for a moment, then began typing a message to Ryan. "We need to talk. I think I've been wrong about everything." It was a small step, but it was a start. Jake didn't know where this road would lead, but he knew he couldn't keep walking the same path. Not after everything he had seen. Not after realizing he had betrayed the one person who had truly believed in him. Jake begins to piece together Marcus's plan and wrestles with the dangerous decision to align himself with the truth, even if it means turning against his fellow officers. The tension in the small meeting room at the community center was suffocating. Marcus leaned against the table, his fists clenched, his eyes locked on Jake with a mixture of distrust and contempt. Across from him, Jake sat stiffly, the weight of his badge heavier than ever. The documents Marcus had risked everything to protect sat between them, untouched. "You expect me to believe you're on my side now?" Marcus asked, his voice razor-sharp. "After everything you've done to my family?" Jake held his ground, though guilt churned in his gut. "You think I don't know how bad I've screwed up? I can't undo the past, Marcus. But if we don't work together, those files will disappear, and the people who've hurt you and your family will keep getting away with it." Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "The same system you've spent your career defending? Now you suddenly care?" Jake didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "I do care. I care because I finally see what Elijah saw, and what I was too blind to understand. Those bastards aren't just your enemies, they're mine too. If you let me help, we can expose them." Marcus narrowed his eyes, searching for any sign of deception. He wanted to believe Jake, but the years of pain inflicted by men like him wouldn't let go so easily. Before Marcus could respond, the door burst open. Ryan entered, his face pale, and his words rushed. "We've got trouble. It's them. They're here." Jake's stomach dropped. "How many?" "2 cars, at least 5 men," Ryan replied, his voice tight. "They're sweeping the building. They know Marcus is here." Marcus grabbed the documents, shoving them into his backpack. "We don't have time for this. If they get their hands on these, it's over." Jake stood, his jaw tightening. "Not on my watch." He turned to Ryan. "Get the community center staff out. Lock the exits except for the rear. We'll use it as a fallback point." Ryan hesitated, then nodded and left, his footsteps fading down the hall. "Why are you even still here?" Marcus demanded, glaring at Jake. "You should be out there with them, covering for your buddies." "Because I'm not one of them," Jake shot back. "Not anymore. You don't have to trust me, but right now I'm your best shot at keeping those files safe." Marcus hated how much sense that made. He strapped on his backpack, muttering, "This better not be another setup, Peterson." The sound of boots echoed in the hallway, drawing closer. Jake motioned for Marcus to move. "Stay behind me." Marcus scoffed. "I'm not hiding behind you." Jake didn't argue. They moved quickly, heading for the back exit. As they turned a corner, one of the corrupt officers spotted them. "Stop right there!" the man barked, raising his gun. Jake stepped in front of Marcus, his hands up. "Easy, Carter. We don't need to do this." Officer Carter sneered, his finger hovering over the trigger. "You think I don't know what you're doing, Peterson? Hand over the files, and we'll forget this little betrayal." Marcus moved to the side, his eyes locked on Carter. "You're not getting anything." Carter's lip curled. "You're really going to let this piece of trash call the shots, Jake? Think about your career." Jake took a step forward, his voice firm. "My career's already over. The second I let you idiots take control, I lost it. Now lower your weapon." The tension snapped like a rubber band. Carter lunged forward, but Marcus was faster. He shoved Jake aside and tackled Carter, slamming him into the wall. The gun clattered to the floor as the 2 men grappled. Another officer appeared at the end of the hallway, his weapon drawn. Jake reacted instinctively, diving for Carter's gun. He rolled to his feet, aiming it at the newcomer. "Drop it!" Jake shouted, his voice sharp enough to cut through the chaos. The second officer hesitated, but the sound of Marcus's fist connecting with Carter's jaw drew his attention. Jake didn't wait for him to act. He surged forward, disarming the man with a quick strike to his wrist and shoving him against the wall. Marcus finally subdued Carter, pinning him to the floor. "How many more are with you?" he demanded, his voice like steel. Carter spat blood onto the floor, his defiance intact. "You think this changes anything? We'll find you. We'll bury you." Jake stepped over him, his face unreadable. "Not if we bury you first." He glanced at Marcus. "Let's move." The 2 men hurried down the hall, the sound of reinforcements echoing behind them. They reached the rear exit, only to find it blocked by 2 more officers. "Stay here," Jake said, shoving Marcus into the corner. "What are you—" Jake didn't let him finish. He stepped into the doorway, his hands up. "It's me, Peterson," he called. "I've got him cornered. He's got the files." The officers exchanged a glance. "Good, let's take him in." Jake nodded, stepping closer. As soon as he was within reach, he struck. A well-placed elbow to the throat of the first officer sent him reeling. The second swung his baton, but Jake ducked and delivered a swift kick to his knee, sending him to the ground. "Now, Marcus!" Jake yelled. Marcus bolted past them, pushing through the door and into the alley beyond. Jake followed, his breath ragged. "Where's Ryan?" Marcus asked, glancing back. Jake shook his head. "I don't know, but we can't wait." They sprinted through the alley, the shouts of pursuing officers growing louder. Jake led them through a maze of side streets, his knowledge of the area buying them precious seconds. Finally, they ducked into a storage shed behind a derelict building. As they caught their breath, Marcus rounded on Jake. "Why didn't you just turn me in back there? Would have been easier for you." Jake glared at him, his voice low. "I already told you, I'm done playing their game. This is bigger than you or me. Those files can expose everything, but only if we keep them out of their hands." Marcus hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "If you're lying to me." "I'm not," Jake interrupted. The sound of sirens in the distance spurred them to action. Jake peeked out, ensuring the coast was clear. "We need a plan," Marcus said. Jake glanced at the backpack. "First, we make sure those files stay safe. After that, we take the fight to them." For the first time, Marcus saw something in Jake's eyes that resembled sincerity. It didn't erase his anger or his mistrust, but it was enough to keep going. Marcus and Jake reluctantly agree on their next steps, setting the stage for a larger confrontation with the corrupt officers. Tensions between the two remain high, but a fragile alliance begins to form. Jake sat at the edge of a dimly lit table in an abandoned safe house. The documents Marcus had been protecting splayed out before him. Each page he read tightened the knot in his stomach. Reports of abuse, cover-ups, and systemic corruption within the force painted a damning picture. Every word felt like a hammer strike, shattering the illusions Jake had clung to for years. "You look surprised," Marcus said from the other side of the room, his tone edged with bitterness. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Jake with a mix of suspicion and disdain. Jake didn't look up. "I didn't know it was this bad." Marcus barked a humorless laugh. "You didn't know, or you didn't want to know? There's a difference." Jake set the papers down, his gaze meeting Marcus's. "I've seen things, sure. I've heard whispers, but I never thought it ran this deep." "Because you never had to," Marcus shot back. "You wore the badge. You had the power. People like me? We're on the receiving end. We don't get to look away." Jake stood abruptly, pacing the room. "This isn't just a few bad cops. This is a network. They've been protecting each other for decades." He gestured to the files. "Who else knows about this?" Marcus stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Not enough people. That's why I've been keeping this safe. My father, your mentor, started gathering this before he died. He knew it was dangerous. He knew they'd come after us." Jake stopped pacing. "Your father. Elijah never told me about this. Would you have listened if he did?" Marcus countered. The question stung more than Jake wanted to admit. He sat back down, flipping through the documents again. "What's the story behind these?" Marcus hesitated, then pulled up a chair across from Jake. He tapped the tattoo on his forearm, a symbol Jake now recognized from several pages in the files. "This," Marcus began, "isn't just ink. It's a promise. My family's been wearing this mark for generations. It stands for resistance against injustice, no matter the cost." Jake studied the design more closely. A circle encasing a tree with deep roots and outstretched branches. "What does it mean exactly?" Marcus's voice softened, though his intensity remained. "The circle represents unity. The tree? That's endurance. It's a reminder that we're part of something bigger, something that doesn't crumble under pressure. My father believed in that. He fought for it, even when it cost him everything." Jake leaned back, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. "And you're carrying on that fight." Marcus nodded. "I didn't have a choice. After Elijah was gone, someone had to pick up where he left off." Jake exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "This symbol, this fight, it's personal for you. For your family. It's personal for a lot of families," Marcus replied, his voice rising. "You think Amelia and I are the only ones who've suffered? Open your eyes, Jake. This system you've been protecting, it's designed to crush people like us." Jake's jaw tightened. "You think I don't see that now? Why do you think I'm still here? I could have walked away after tonight. Let them handle you. But I didn't. Marcus's eyes narrowed. And why didn't you? Guilt. Redemption? Or is this just about saving your own ass? Jake hesitated, the question cutting deeper than he expected. He sighed, his voice quieter. Maybe it's all of that, maybe it's more, I don't know. But I do know that what's in these files, it needs to come out. Marcus leaned forward, his tone sharp. You're right about that. But getting this out means putting a target on your back. Are you ready for that? Jake met Marcus's gaze, his expression resolute. I don't think I've got a choice anymore. A tense silence hung between them, broken only by the distant hum of the city outside. Jake stood again, scanning the files for actionable evidence. He paused at a list of names, a who's who of high-ranking officers tied to various abuses of power. His finger hovered over a name he recognized. Captain Brooks, Jake muttered. Marcus's expression darkened. You know him? Jake nodded. He's been with the department for decades, always seemed untouchable. If he's involved, he's not just involved, Marcus interrupted. He's orchestrating half of it. My father found proof before he died. It's in there somewhere. Jake searched through the pile, pulling out a faded letter marked with Elijah's handwriting. The letter detailed secret meetings, money exchanges, and cover-ups, all pointing back to Brooks. This could blow the whole thing open, Jake said, his voice tinged with urgency. Marcus's skepticism returned. And you think they're just going to let you walk into the precinct and expose this? Jake shook his head. No, but there's a way to make this public without giving them the chance to bury it. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And how do you plan to do that? Jake hesitated, then glanced at Marcus. We leak it. Media outlets, community leaders, anyone who can make noise. If we get enough attention, they won't be able to silence it. Marcus considered the idea, his expression unreadable. And you're willing to put yourself on the line for that? Jake's voice hardened. I'm already in too deep to back out now. Besides, if I don't, who will? Another silence passed. But this one felt different. There was no longer outright hostility between them, only a cautious, mutual understanding. Finally, Marcus nodded. All right. But this isn't just about exposing them. It's about protecting the people they've hurt. People like Amelia and Ethan. Jake met his gaze. I'll make sure they're safe. You have my word. A knock at the door made both men freeze. Jake motioned for Marcus to stay quiet, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. Who is it? Jake demanded. It's me, Ryan's voice called from the other side. Jake opened the door cautiously. Ryan slipped inside, his expression grim. They're sweeping the area. You don't have much time. Marcus grabbed his bag. Then we move now. Jake nodded, his mind racing. We split up. Marcus, you head to the drop point and get those files out. Ryan and I will cover your exit. Ryan looked uneasy. And what happens when they come after us? Jake's expression hardened. We handle it. No matter what. Marcus slung the bag over his shoulder, pausing at the door. If you screw me over, I won't, Jake said firmly. For the first time, Marcus gave him a faint nod of acknowledgement. Then he disappeared into the night. As Jake and Ryan prepared to face whatever was coming, one thought lingered in Jake's mind. He was finally on the right side of the fight, but it might cost him everything. Jake and Marcus's actions trigger a chain reaction, forcing the corrupt officers to retaliate. The stakes rise as the fight for justice becomes even more dangerous. The conference room at the precinct buzzed with tension as Jake Peterson stepped inside. The air was thick with hostility. Officers clustered in small groups, whispering amongst themselves. Captain Brooks stood at the head of the room, his presence commanding, his eyes sharp as they landed on Jake. Peterson, Brooks called out, his voice cold. We've been waiting. Jake squared his shoulders and moved toward the long table, his steps deliberate. Every officer in the room was either complicit in the corruption or too afraid to challenge it. The walls seemed to close in as Jake took his seat, the accusatory glares piercing through him. Brooks wasted no time. You've been working against this department, collaborating with the suspect. Care to explain yourself? Jake's jaw tightened. Collaborating? You mean trying to expose the truth? A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Brooks raised a hand to silence them, his gaze fixed on Jake. Watch your tone. You're treading on thin ice. Jake leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. Thin ice? That's rich coming from you, Captain. I've seen the files, the cover-ups, the bribes. You've been protecting criminals, all while wearing that badge. The room erupted in gasps and sharp whispers. Brooks's face darkened, and he slammed his fist on the table. Enough! You don't know what you're talking about. Jake didn't flinch. Don't I? Elijah knew. He gathered the evidence. And now Marcus and I have it. You think you can silence me, but it's too late. The truth is out there. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others crossed their arms, their faces hardening with defiance. Detective Monroe, one of Brooks's loyalists, stood up. You're a damn traitor, Peterson. Siding with a criminal against your own? That's disgraceful. Jake shot him a glare. Disgraceful? What's disgraceful is using your badge to intimidate, extort, and destroy lives. Don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about. Monroe stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. You're biting off more than you can chew. You keep this up, and you'll find yourself out of a job. Or worse. Jake stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Go ahead. Try to scare me. I'm not backing down. Not this time. Brooks's voice cut through the escalating tension. That's enough. He glared at Jake, his tone laced with menace. You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing but a liability. If you keep pushing, you'll regret it. Jake stepped closer to the table, his voice rising. You've already destroyed enough lives, Captain. Marcus's family, Amelia, and who knows how many others. This department is supposed to stand for justice, but you've turned it into a cesspool of corruption. Brooks leaned in, his face inches from Jake's. You don't know the first thing about justice. You're naive if you think you can change anything. This system is bigger than you, bigger than me. And if you keep poking the bear, you'll get mauled. The room fell silent, the weight of Brooks's words hanging heavily in the air. Ryan Carter, who had been standing quietly in the corner, finally spoke up. Maybe Jake's right. All eyes turned to him, the young officer's voice trembling but resolute. This department's broken, Ryan continued. We've all seen it, we've all ignored it. But how much longer can we pretend nothing's wrong? Brooks's glare shifted to Ryan. Careful, Carter. You don't want to throw your career away over this. Ryan straightened his shoulders. I'd rather lose my badge than my integrity. Jake glanced at Ryan, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face. He turned back to Brooks. You can threaten us all you want, but you can't stop what's coming. The evidence is out there. The people will know the truth. Brooks smirked, his expression cold. You're a fool, Peterson. Do you really think anyone will believe you? You're just one man against an entire system. You'll be buried before you can make a dent. Jake's voice hardened. We'll see about that. Monroe stepped forward again, this time with barely restrained anger. You think you're untouchable? We can ruin you, Peterson. Your career, your reputation, gone. Is that what you want? Jake didn't waver. If it means exposing the truth, then so be it. The tension reached its breaking point as Brooks straightened, his calm exterior cracking just enough to reveal the fury beneath. You've made your choice, Peterson. Don't expect any help when it all falls apart. Jake's lips curled into a defiant smirk. I don't need your help. I've got the truth on my side. Let's see how far your threats get you when the world sees what you've done. Brooks slammed his hand on the table one final time, signaling the end of the meeting. Get out of my sight. Jake didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel, walking out of the room with his head held high. Ryan followed close behind, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. As they exited the precinct, Ryan finally spoke. What now? Jake stopped, glancing back at the building. Now we fight, and we don't stop until this whole thing comes crashing down. The corrupt officers retaliate, escalating their efforts to silence Jake and Marcus, forcing the two to make desperate moves to protect the evidence and their lives. The air was heavy with tension as Marcus made his way to the agreed-upon meeting point. A worn leather bag containing the damning evidence was slung over his shoulder, its weight a constant reminder of the stakes. The dim streetlights cast long shadows, and every sound felt magnified in the silence. Marcus stopped at a corner near the community center, glancing around warily. He knew the risks. He'd been followed before, but this time, the danger felt imminent. Suddenly, the roar of an engine shattered the stillness. A black SUV screeched to a halt nearby, and four men in plain clothes stepped out, their intentions unmistakable. "Hand over the bag," one of them barked, advancing with purpose. Marcus instinctively stepped back, gripping the strap tightly. "You're not getting it. Not tonight. Not ever." The leader smirked. "You really think you're going to walk away? We know what's in that bag, and we're not leaving without it." Before Marcus could respond, one of the men lunged at him. Marcus twisted away, his elbow connecting with the assailant's jaw. But the others closed in quickly, overwhelming him. The struggle was chaotic. Fists flying, shouts echoing through the empty streets. Marcus fought with desperation, knowing what was at stake, but he was outnumbered and outmatched. Just as one of the men wrenched the bag from his grasp, the sound of a car skidding to a stop pierced the chaos. Jake Peterson emerged from his vehicle, gun drawn, his face a mixture of anger and determination. "Back off!" Jake's voice cut through the noise like a whip. The men froze for a moment, then turned toward him. The leader sneered. "Peterson, you really want to go down with him? Step aside." Jake didn't flinch. "You want that bag? You're going to have to go through me." The tension was palpable as the men hesitated, weighing their options. Then, one of them charged at Jake, forcing the standoff into action. Jake's fist collided with the man's stomach, sending him stumbling back. Another attacker lunged, but Jake sidestepped, delivering a sharp blow to his side. Marcus, regaining his footing, joined the fray, tackling one of the men trying to grab the bag. The fight was brutal and unrelenting. Jake ducked as a crowbar swung past his head, retaliating with a swift uppercut that sent his attacker sprawling. Marcus wrestled the bag from another man's grip, using it as a shield to block a punch. "You should have stayed in your lane, Peterson," one of the men growled, swinging a pipe. Jake narrowly avoided the blow, countering with a kick that sent the weapon clattering to the ground. "Maybe you should have learned what justice actually means." The two men fought side by side, their movements a chaotic dance of survival and resolve. Marcus managed to shove one assailant into a dumpster, while Jake pinned another against a wall, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. "Who sent you?" Jake demanded, his voice sharp. The man struggled, refusing to answer. Jake shoved him aside, his focus returning to the fight. Seeing their efforts failing, one of the attackers grabbed the bag and bolted. Marcus yelled, "He's got it!" and took off after him, with Jake close behind. The chase tore through narrow alleys and abandoned lots, the man with the bag weaving through obstacles in a desperate attempt to escape. Marcus pushed himself harder, his breaths ragged as he closed the gap. Jake sprinted ahead, cutting through a side alley to intercept the runner. He emerged just as the man turned a corner, tackling him to the ground. The bag skidded across the pavement. "End of the line," Jake growled, pinning the man down. Marcus caught up, grabbing the bag and clutching it tightly. "We've got it," he said, his voice firm but breathless. The remaining attackers arrived, their faces twisted with anger. One of them snarled, "You're making a big mistake, Peterson. This isn't over." Jake rose slowly, his gun trained on them. "Walk away while you still can." For a moment, it seemed like the men might push their luck, but the look in Jake's eyes made them hesitate. With a string of curses, they backed off, disappearing into the shadows. Marcus leaned against a wall, catching his breath. "That was too close." Jake nodded, his face grim. "They're not going to stop. We need to get this to someone we can trust. Now." Marcus straightened, gripping the bag tightly. "I know just the person." The two made their way to the home of a respected community leader, Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, a retired judge known for her integrity. Jake kept watch outside as Marcus handed the bag to Eleanor, explaining its contents. "These documents need to see the light of day," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. Eleanor nodded solemnly. "I'll make sure they do." "You've done the right thing, Marcus." Jake joined them inside, his expression unreadable. "This isn't just about the evidence," he said. "We need to make sure those men, and everyone they're protecting, are held accountable." Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder. "We'll take it step by step. The fight's just beginning, but you've both made a difference tonight." As Jake and Marcus left Eleanor's home, the weight of their actions settled over them. We bought ourselves some time, Marcus said. Jake nodded, his face set with determination. But they'll come at us harder now. We need to be ready. The victory was bittersweet, a small triumph in a larger battle. Both men knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but neither was willing to back down. As they disappeared into the night, the first glimmers of dawn painted the horizon, a faint promise of hope in the face of the storm to come. Jake stood at the front steps of Marcus and Amelia's modest home, his heart pounding. The weight of his past actions bore down on him, but the stakes were clear. He needed to take accountability for the damage he had caused. Raising his hand, he knocked firmly on the door. Moments later, the door creaked open. Amelia stood there, her expression a mix of wariness and defiance. Behind her, Marcus appeared, his gaze hard and unyielding. "What do you want, Jake?" Marcus asked, his tone clipped. "I need to talk," Jake began, his voice steady but laced with tension. "Not as an officer. As a man who knows he's done wrong." Amelia crossed her arms, her protective stance unwavering. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here after everything you've done." Jake nodded, accepting the hostility. "I deserve that. I don't expect forgiveness. Not right now, maybe not ever. But I need you to hear me out." Amelia hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. Marcus followed, his presence a silent reminder of the consequences Jake faced if this conversation went south. Standing in the small living room, Jake took a deep breath. "I was wrong," he said, his voice firm. "I let prejudice blind me. I let power corrupt me. I hurt you, Amelia. I hurt your family. And for that, I'm deeply sorry." Amelia's eyes narrowed. "Sorry doesn't undo the trauma. Sorry doesn't erase what you did to me in front of my son." Jake looked down, guilt etched on his face. "You're right, it doesn't. But I'm not here to erase the past. I'm here to take responsibility for it, and to make things right, however I can." Marcus crossed his arms, his tone sharp. "And how do you plan to do that?" "Words don't mean much when we're still living with the damage." Jake met Marcus's gaze, unflinching. "I've already started exposing the corruption in the department. It's not just about me anymore. It's about changing a system that's hurt too many people for too long." Amelia stepped forward, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "You want to make things right? Prove it. Prove you're not just another officer looking to save face. Show me, day by day, that you're serious about this." Jake nodded without hesitation. "You have my word. I'll back it up with action. I'm not going to stop until the truth is out, and the people responsible are held accountable." Amelia held his gaze for a long moment before speaking. "Words are easy, Jake. What you did to me, to my family, there's no quick fix for that. If you're serious, you'll have to earn every inch of trust back, and even then, it won't be the same." "I understand," Jake said softly, "and I'm ready for that." In the weeks that followed, Jake began to work alongside Marcus, their partnership uneasy but functional. Jake used his connections within the department to quietly gather additional evidence, while Marcus coordinated with trusted community members to ensure the evidence stayed safe. The tension between the two men remained palpable. Marcus often questioned Jake's motives, pushing him to explain why he had suddenly decided to fight against the very system he had once upheld. "It's not sudden," Jake admitted one evening as they reviewed a series of incriminating documents. "It's been building for a while. I just didn't have the courage to face it. Until now." Marcus snorted. "Courage, huh? It's easy to be brave when you've got nothing left to lose." Jake paused, the words stinging with truth. "You're right. I'm at rock bottom. But that means I've got no choice but to climb back up. And I'm starting by doing the right thing." Over time, Jake's actions began to speak louder than his words. He accompanied Marcus to community meetings, standing in solidarity as they presented evidence of corruption to trusted leaders. At one such meeting, a local activist confronted Jake directly. "Why should we believe anything you say? You were part of the problem." Jake didn't flinch. And I can't change that. But I'm here now because I want to be part of the solution. You have every right to doubt me. All I can do is keep showing up." Marcus watched the exchange, his skepticism softening slightly. While trust wasn't fully restored, he began to see that Jake's commitment was genuine. Amelia, meanwhile, remained cautious. Though she saw Jake's efforts, she refused to let him off the hook easily. One afternoon, Jake approached her after a meeting. "I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for," he said, "but I hope one day I can earn even a small piece of your trust." Amelia's response was blunt. "Trust isn't given, Jake. It's built. And right now, you're still standing in the rubble of what you broke. Keep working, and maybe, just maybe, you can start building something new." Her words fueled Jake's determination. He threw himself into the fight against corruption with renewed vigor, knowing that every small victory brought him closer to making amends. As Jake's involvement in exposing the department's corruption deepened, he faced increasing backlash. Anonymous threats arrived in the form of phone calls and notes left on his car. His former allies within the force ostracized him, labeling him a traitor. One evening, Jake returned home to find his front door ajar. Inside, his living room was ransacked, and a message scrawled on the wall read, "Back off." Instead of retreating, Jake doubled down. He called Marcus that night, his voice resolute. "They're trying to scare me, but I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever." Marcus's reply was cautious, but supportive. "Just remember, Jake, you're not in this alone anymore. We're in this together." The bond between Marcus and Jake, though fragile, began to solidify through their shared purpose. Amelia remained watchful, her trust in Jake still a work in progress. As new evidence emerged and the stakes grew higher, Jake knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity, a purpose that transcended his own guilt and mistakes. The road to redemption was long, and the challenges ahead were daunting. But Jake was ready to face them head-on, determined to prove that change, though difficult, was possible. Jake stood outside the precinct, the weight of silence pressing against him. The parking lot, once filled with casual chatter among officers, now felt hostile. Passing colleagues either ignored him or threw sharp glares his way. He was no longer one of them. Inside the station, a few officers whispered as he walked past. The hostility was unspoken but palpable, a constant reminder that his decision to expose corruption had turned him into an outcast. Yet, Jake didn't falter. He knew the isolation was a small price to pay for standing on the side of truth. As the walls of his old life closed in, Jake found unexpected support. Marcus, now a reluctant partner, reached out more often. Though their conversations were still marked by tension, a fragile sense of trust began to take root. One evening, Jake met Marcus and Amelia at a community hall. The room was packed with residents eager to learn more about the evidence Marcus had uncovered. Jake took a deep breath as he prepared to speak, his uniform a stark contrast to the civilians around him. "I was part of the problem," Jake began, his voice steady despite the weight of the confession. "I let my biases blind me, but now I'm here to help fix what I broke, no matter how long it takes." Amelia stood nearby, her expression guarded. She had yet to forgive Jake fully, but she couldn't deny his growing commitment. A voice from the crowd broke the silence. "Why should we trust you, Jake? You're still wearing the badge that's oppressed us for years." Jake met the man's gaze. "You shouldn't trust me. Not yet. Trust is earned, and I'm here to earn it, one step at a time." The crowd murmured, some nodding in reluctant agreement. The evidence Marcus had collected began to ripple through the community. Local journalists picked up the story, and soon, headlines detailed decades of corruption within the police force. The documents also implicated high-ranking officers, forcing the department to launch an internal investigation. Protests erupted, demanding transparency and reform. At the center of it all were Marcus and Jake, an unlikely duo united by a shared goal. Ryan, the young officer who had once hesitated to take a stand, approached Jake during one of the protests. "I saw the reports," Ryan said, his tone conflicted. "You were right to expose them. I wish I'd had your courage sooner." Jake gave a small nod. "It's not about courage, Ryan. It's about doing what's right, even when it costs you." One evening, Marcus called Jake with urgent news. "The department's leadership is on the verge of collapse," Marcus said, his voice laced with determination. "Your testimony and the documents are forcing changes we never thought possible." Jake allowed himself a moment of relief, but Marcus's next words brought him back to reality. "This is just the beginning. There's still a lot to clean up." The two met at the same community hall where their partnership had first begun to take shape. This time, The room was quieter, the attendees smaller in number but stronger in resolve. Marcus addressed the group. These changes wouldn't have happened without everyone here. But we can't stop now. This fight isn't over. Jake stood beside him, the weight of their shared journey heavy on his shoulders. It's going to take all of us, he added. And it's going to take time. Back at the precinct, Jake faced retaliation from his remaining colleagues. Anonymous notes appeared in his locker, warning him to stay silent. His patrol assignments became increasingly dangerous, leading him into volatile situations without backup. Late one night, as Jake walked to his car, he found his tires slashed and a threatening message scratched into the paint. Traitor. He clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. But instead of lashing out, Jake took a deep breath. He called Marcus. They're not going to stop, Jake said. They're trying to break me. They can try, Marcus replied. But they can't erase the truth. Stay focused, Jake. We're in this together. Despite the setbacks, progress began to take shape. New policies were introduced to address bias and hold officers accountable. Community leaders worked alongside reform-minded officers to build trust. Jake attended one such meeting, sitting quietly as residents voiced their concerns. Amelia, standing at the back of the room, watched him closely. After the meeting, she approached Jake. "You've come a long way," she said, her tone softer than he expected. Jake nodded. "Still a long way to go." "You're right," she replied. "But maybe there's hope." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. As the months passed, the weight of the battle remained. Jake's career in law enforcement was forever changed. His reputation within the department was shattered, but in the eyes of the community, he was slowly becoming an ally. One evening, as Jake and Marcus sat on the steps of the community hall, Marcus broke the silence. "You ever think about walking away, leaving all this behind?" Jake shook his head. "Not anymore. I've got too much to make up for." Marcus studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good, because we're going to need you when the next fight comes." Jake smirked, a rare moment of levity between them. "I'll be ready." As Jake drove home that night, the city stretched out before him, its lights flickering like fragile beacons of hope. The battle against corruption and prejudice was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose. He had made mistakes, devastating ones, but he was determined to be part of the solution. Each step forward, no matter how small, was a step toward redemption. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Jake knew he wasn't walking it alone. Marcus, Amelia, and the community had become his compass, guiding him toward a better version of himself. And though the fight for justice would never truly end, Jake was ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in years, he saw the possibility of change, and he was determined to see it through. What about you? If you were in Jake's shoes, would you have the courage to stand up against the very system you once trusted? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that spark conversation and inspire change. Together, let's keep the fight for justice alive.
It was an ordinary afternoon in Jacksonville, Florida. The sun seemed to shine especially brightly over the residential neighborhoods, reflecting off the luxury cars parked along the immaculately clean streets of Arlington Hills. The local shops were bustling, with people coming and going, carrying bags and exchanging distracted conversations, a calm that seemed unshakable. Inside a park patrol car at the corner of a charming cafe, Randy Thompson twirled his keys between his fingers, his gaze fixed on a black SUV parked across the street. Something about the scene unsettled him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Perhaps it was the driver, a black man, impeccably dressed in a suit, sitting behind the wheel of a car that cost more than Randy would make in 2 years. "Something's not right," he muttered to himself. Next to him, the patrol car's radio crackled with routine updates. Nothing out of the ordinary. Minor thefts, medical assistance calls, the kind of stuff Randy dismissed as trivial. He felt he was destined for something bigger, but years of patrolling peaceful neighborhoods had left him impatient, like a caged lion. He was always on the lookout for something or someone to justify his simmering anger. Randy pressed the radio button and called dispatch. Unit 205, at the corner of Arlington and Main. I'm approaching a suspicious vehicle, he said with a confidence that seemed misplaced. Dispatch responded mechanically, giving standard authorization, but there was nothing suspicious about the scene. Just a man parked in a car, checking something on his phone. A few feet away, Elijah Brooks ended a quick phone call with his wife, Donna. "Yes, honey, I'm on my way," he said, glancing at his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. He was running late for an event at the Mayport Naval Base, where he was set to be honored for more than 25 years of impeccable service in the Navy. Despite his tardiness, his demeanor was calm. Elijah had always been that way. Focused, disciplined, a man who rarely let his emotions show. But something about that day felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. He just felt it. Elijah adjusted his tie in the rear-view mirror, ensuring the knot was perfect. He knew he'd be surrounded by high-ranking officers and political figures, and he needed to look impeccable, not because he cared about their opinions, but because that's how he carried himself. A leader, an example. He was about to start the car when he noticed a patrol car pulling up beside him. The officer stepped out slowly, adjusting his belt and holster as if wanting to be noticed. Elijah sighed. He recognized the type immediately. The rigid walk, the hand hovering near the gun, the exaggerated air of authority. He had encountered many men like this over the years. "Good afternoon, officer," Elijah said, rolling down the window calmly. "Is there a problem?" Randy didn't respond immediately. He assessed Elijah with a sharp, piercing gaze, as if searching for something. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" he asked, his voice hard and direct. "Parked. Waiting to get on my way," Elijah replied, keeping his voice controlled but firm. He knew how quickly these encounters could escalate. "Why do you ask?" "You look out of place," Randy said, deliberately ignoring the polite tone of Elijah's response. He placed his hands on his belt, ensuring the gun at his side was prominently visible. License, registration, and ID. Now, Elijah stared at Randy for a moment, trying to gauge the seriousness of the situation. He opened the glove compartment slowly, aware that every move was being scrutinized. He pulled out his driver's license and, along with it, his military ID. "I'm Commander Elijah Brooks, an officer in the United States Navy. I'm on my way to a military event. Here are my documents." Randy took the papers, but didn't bother to look at them. Instead, he crossed his arms, as if Elijah's introduction was irrelevant. "Commander, huh? And what exactly brought you to this neighborhood? Looking for something, maybe?" "Officer, I'm trying to understand where you're going with this," Elijah said, his tone now more serious. "I'm fully aware of my rights, and so far, you haven't provided a clear reason for the stop." "I give the orders here, Mr. Brooks," Randy shot back, deliberately refusing to address Elijah by his military title. He stepped back, his hand resting on his weapon. "Step out of the vehicle." Slowly, a small crowd was beginning to gather nearby. Pedestrians stopped in their tracks, some pulling out their phones as the atmosphere on the street began to shift. Elijah noticed the curious and concerned stares but remained calm. He'd been in far more tense situations than this, but not here, not in his own country. "Officer," Elijah began, trying to defuse what was starting to feel inevitable, "you're making a mistake, and I suggest you stop before this goes too far." Randy didn't reply. He raised his voice, as if speaking to both Elijah and the crowd. "Get out of the vehicle now, or I'll remove you by force." "That's an order." The tension in the air was palpable, and the silence among the onlookers only made the situation more unbearable. Elijah knew that at this moment, any wrong move could trigger a disaster. With a heavy sigh, he unlocked the door and stepped out slowly, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "On your knees," Randy ordered, his voice now laced with hatred. Elijah hesitated, locking eyes with the officer in a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. But with a gun pointed at him and Randy's cold, unyielding glare, there was no choice. He knelt on the cold pavement, feeling the weight not just of the humiliation, but of what this moment symbolized for him. and for everyone watching. The weight of the situation bore down on Elijah as he knelt on the pavement, his back straight and his hands clasped loosely behind his head. His mind raced, not with fear, but with a controlled, simmering anger that he'd learned to channel after decades of service. He could hear the whispers from the gathering crowd, see the glimmer of cell phone cameras, catching every humiliating second. But the loudest thing in the air was Randy's voice, sharp and commanding, as though the situation wasn't a shameful display of prejudice, but a triumphant assertion of power. "You think you're special because of that uniform?" Randy sneered, standing over Elijah, his hand still resting on the holster of his gun. "Everyone's equal under my jurisdiction. You don't get a pass because of some military badge." Elijah glanced up, his jaw tight. The crowd had grown larger, with several people openly recording the scene. A woman in her mid-30s was whispering into her phone, likely calling for help. Nearby, a teenage boy muttered, "This is messed up," earning a sharp glance from his mother, who pulled him back to the curb. Elijah could feel the collective outrage in the air, but for now, it was a silent one. "Officer," Elijah began, his voice measured, "you're making a grave mistake. I've given you my identification. I've followed every one of your commands. There's no reason to escalate this any further." Randy ignored him, circling like a predator. "You Navy types, always thinking you're above the law. Let me tell you something. This is my street, my rules. And if I think you're suspicious, you're suspicious. End of story." Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. Randy's words didn't cut him, but they did something worse. They confirmed every stereotype Elijah had fought against his entire life. No amount of medals, rank, or service had shielded him from being reduced to a mere suspicious figure in the eyes of someone like Randy. The crowd murmured louder as Randy pulled out his handcuffs and stepped closer. "Stand up," he barked. Elijah hesitated, his instincts warning him of how quickly this could spiral out of control. But with dozens of phones recording, he knew his best option was compliance. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his movements deliberate. Randy wasted no time, grabbing Elijah's arm and twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. Elijah winced but didn't resist as the cold metal of the cuffs bit into his wrists. "Is this really necessary?" Elijah asked, turning his head slightly to meet Randy's eyes. "You're arresting me with no cause, no justification. This isn't law enforcement. It's abuse of power. You don't get to tell me how to do my job," Randy snapped, tightening the cuffs. "And I don't owe you an explanation." At that moment, a woman from the crowd stepped forward. She was young, probably in her late 20s, her curly hair pulled back into a ponytail. She held her phone up high, the red recording glaring in the corner of the screen. "This is illegal," she called out, her voice firm but shaking slightly. "You can't just cuff someone for no reason. He's done nothing wrong." Randy turned sharply, his face flushed with anger. "Back off, lady. This is official police business." The woman didn't move. "We're all watching," she said, her voice steadying. "We're recording, and we're not going to let you get away with this." Randy's glare darkened, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the growing tension. "That's enough, Officer Thompson." The crowd parted as Captain Sarah Martinez, Randy's direct supervisor, approached the scene. She was dressed in her police uniform, her dark hair tied neatly at the back of her head, and her expression was a mixture of anger and disbelief. Behind her were two other officers, both looking uneasy as they surveyed the crowd and the cameras. "Captain," Randy said, his tone defensive, "I was just handling." "Handling what?" Sarah snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs of the onlookers. She marched straight to Elijah, her eyes widening slightly as recognition dawned. "Oh my God," she muttered under her breath. "Commander Brooks?" Elijah, still standing with his wrists cuffed, met her gaze. "Captain Martinez, good to see someone who recognizes me." he said, his voice calm but edged with restrained anger. Sarah's face turned pale. She turned to Randy, her expression hardening. "Take those cuffs off him. Right now." Randy hesitated. "Captain, I was—" "Now!" Sarah barked, her voice echoing across the street. The crowd fell silent, the tension crackling in the air like an electric current. Randy's jaw clenched as he reluctantly pulled out his keys and unlocked the cuffs. Elijah flexed his wrists as they came free, but his posture remained composed, a testament to his years of training. Sarah stepped closer to Randy, her voice low but furious. "What the hell were you thinking? Do you even know who this is?" "I don't care who he is," Randy shot back, his voice defiant. "He looked suspicious, and I acted accordingly." "Suspicious?" Sarah's voice rose again, and the crowd leaned in, their phones capturing every word. "You pointed a gun at a decorated commander in the United States Navy, a man on his way to a military event. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I did my job," Randy insisted, but his voice wavered slightly. "No, you didn't," Sarah said, stepping closer until they were almost nose to nose. "You abused your authority, humiliated an innocent man, and made this department look like a joke. Do you realize how many cameras are on us right now? Do you realize what's going to happen when this goes viral?" Randy's face flushed red, but he didn't respond. Sarah turned back to Elijah, her expression softening. "Commander Brooks, I am so sorry for what's happened here. Please know this does not represent the values of our department." "With all due respect, Captain," Elijah said, his voice steady, "it does. Or he wouldn't have felt empowered to do this in the first place." Sarah flinched at the truth in his words. She turned to the other officers. "Escort Officer Thompson back to the precinct. I'll deal with him personally." When they hesitated, she added sharply, "Now." The officers moved toward Randy, who took a step back. "You're really going to do this? In front of everyone?" he asked, his voice dripping with indignation. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Yes, because someone has to show the people watching that we're capable of holding our own accountable." As the officers led Randy away, the crowd erupted into murmurs, a mixture of relief and outrage. Elijah turned to Sarah, his expression unreadable. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Sarah nodded. "I know, and I'll do everything I can to make it right." But Elijah wasn't sure if anything could. Not after this. The sun had dipped lower into the Jacksonville skyline, casting long shadows across the city. Inside the crowded briefing room at the police precinct, the air was thick with tension. Elijah sat at the far end of a rectangular table, his back straight and hands folded on the surface. Though outwardly composed, his eyes betrayed a quiet storm brewing within him. Across from him sat Sarah Martinez, the weight of her own authority pressing down on her like a stone. To her right sat Chief Raymond Harris, a man in his mid-50s with a stern expression and a reputation for prioritizing the department's image above all else. Elijah wasn't here for an apology. He was here for accountability. "Commander Brooks," Chief Harris began, his voice measured but detached, "let me start by expressing the department's sincerest regrets for what transpired earlier today. Officer Thompson's actions were unacceptable and do not align with the values we uphold." Elijah raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The word regret hung in the air, hollow and insufficient. "We've already taken immediate action," Harris continued. "Officer Thompson has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. And I can assure you, if found guilty of misconduct, he will face disciplinary action." Elijah leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "Found guilty? With all due respect, Chief, this isn't up for debate. There's a crowd full of witnesses and hours of footage circulating online that prove exactly what happened." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but Harris held his ground. "We understand that, Commander, but due process—" "Spare me the procedural excuses," Elijah interrupted, his tone sharp but controlled. "I've served this country for over 25 years, Chief. I've led men and women into war zones, upheld the highest standards of discipline and integrity. And yet today, I was treated like a criminal, like my life didn't matter. Officer Thompson didn't just humiliate me. He humiliated your department, the same department that allowed him to operate unchecked. Harris frowned, his jaw tightening. Sarah cleared her throat, stepping in to mediate. "Commander Brooks," she said softly, "I understand your anger. Believe me, I do. And I don't disagree with you. But please know that we are committed to addressing this thoroughly." Elijah shifted his gaze to her, his voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. "Captain Martinez, I appreciate your intervention earlier. Truly. But this is bigger than today. I refuse to let this get swept under the rug like so many other incidents." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Harris finally broke it with a sigh, leaning back in his chair. "You're right. We can't ignore this. But you have to understand, cases like this are complicated. There's a system in place, and that system is broken," Elijah countered. "You want to talk about systems? Let's talk about how Officer Thompson's behavior is no isolated incident. How many complaints has he had? How many red flags did you ignore before today?" Sarah's face tightened, her eyes darting briefly to Harris. It was clear she knew something but wasn't ready to speak. Elijah caught the flicker of hesitation and pressed further. "Captain Martinez, you've worked with him. You're his superior. Don't tell me you didn't notice anything." Sarah opened her mouth to respond but faltered. Harris shot her a warning glance, but Elijah was relentless. If this department wants to regain even a shred of credibility, it starts with honesty. "So I'll ask again, how many complaints?" Finally, Sarah exhaled, her shoulders sagging. "5," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the past 3 years, there have been 5 formal complaints filed against Officer Thompson, all for excessive force or racial profiling." Harris stiffened. "Sarah, no." She cut him off, her voice firm. "He deserves to know the truth. Those complaints were dismissed, every single one of them. Some due to lack of evidence, others because the victims didn't want to pursue legal action. But that doesn't mean they weren't valid." Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. His anger was no longer simmering. It was boiling. "Dismissed," he repeated. "You had 5 chances to stop him, and you did nothing. And now you want me to trust that you'll thoroughly address this." "Commander," Harris began, but Elijah wasn't finished. "Do you know what it feels like," Elijah said, his voice rising slightly, "to dedicate your life to serving this country, to sacrificing everything for the ideals of justice and equality, only to be reduced to a suspicious figure because of the color of your skin? Do you know what it feels like to kneel in front of a crowd with a gun pointed at your head, knowing that no rank, no title, no service will save you from the assumptions of a man like Thompson?" The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. Sarah looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. Harris shifted uncomfortably, but Elijah didn't give him the chance to respond. "This isn't just about me," Elijah continued, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "It's about every person who's been stopped, harassed, or humiliated by someone wearing your badge. It's about the system that protects them. And if you think a suspension or a public apology will make this go away, you're sorely mistaken." Before Harris could respond, the door to the room opened and an officer entered, looking nervous. "Chief Harris," he said, holding a file. "You're going to want to see this." Harris took the file and flipped it open, his expression darkening with every page. Sarah leaned over to glance at it, her face paling as she read. Elijah watched them carefully, his instincts telling him this was important. "What is it?" Elijah asked. Harris hesitated, then slid the file across the table. "It's Thompson's record." Elijah opened the file and scanned the contents. His stomach twisted as he read through incident reports, internal memos, and informal complaints that never saw the light of day. It wasn't just the 5 complaints Sarah had mentioned. There were dozens of incidents, some going back nearly a decade. Many were marked as resolved or closed due to insufficient evidence. Others had been quietly settled with payouts to the victims. But the most damning part was a memo from 3 years ago, signed by none other than Harris himself. It was a recommendation to reassign Thompson to administrative duty after an incident involving excessive force against a teenager. The recommendation had been ignored. "You knew," Elijah said, his voice low but seething. "You knew he was a problem, and you let him stay on the streets." Harris looked like he'd been caught in a trap. "It's not that simple. Officers—" "Don't," Elijah interrupted, standing up. He held the file in his hand like a weapon. "You don't get to justify this. Not to me. And not to the people out there demanding answers." Sarah stood as well, her voice quiet but resolute. "Commander, I'll do everything in my power to make this right." Elijah turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Then start by taking responsibility. All of you." He left the room without another word, the file still in his hand. As he walked out of the precinct, the crowd of reporters and protesters outside parted to let him through. He didn't stop to speak. Not yet. He wasn't done. Inside, Sarah and Harris sat in silence. For the first time in her career, Sarah felt the weight of her complicity. And for the first time in his, Harris realized this wouldn't be contained. The night after the confrontation at the precinct, Jacksonville was alive with tension. The footage of Elijah Brooks kneeling on the pavement with Randy Thompson standing over him had gone viral. The hashtags #JusticeForElijah and #AccountabilityNow were trending nationwide. And news networks ran the story on a loop, dissecting every second of the video. Protesters had gathered outside the Jacksonville Police Department, holding signs that read "End Racist Policing" and "We Stand with Commander Brooks." The crowd swelled by the hour, fueled by outrage and a collective call for change. Inside his home, Elijah sat in his dimly lit living room, staring at the file he had taken from the precinct. His wife, Donna, sat across from him, her eyes filled with both worry and quiet fury. "You haven't said much since you got back," Donna said, breaking the silence. "What's on your mind?" Elijah leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the armrest. "It's worse than I thought, Donna. Thompson wasn't just a bad apple. He's a symptom of a much larger problem. Dozens of complaints, all buried. And Harris knew. He knew and still allowed that man to patrol our streets." Donna shook her head, her voice rising slightly. "You shouldn't have to be the one carrying this burden. This isn't just your fight, Elijah. Let someone else." "It is my fight," Elijah interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "I can't ignore this. If I stay quiet, then I'm no better than the people who covered for him." Donna sighed, folding her arms. "I know you're right. I hate seeing you go through this. It's not fair." Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Fairness hasn't been a luxury I've been afforded in a long time, Donna. But this isn't about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been on the wrong side of men like Thompson. I have to do something." Donna reached out, placing a hand over his. "Then do it. But promise me one thing. Don't let this destroy you." Elijah met her gaze, his eyes softening. "I promise." The following morning, Elijah stood at a podium in front of a sea of reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers outside the Jacksonville Police Department. Cameras flashed as he adjusted the microphone, taking a moment to steady himself. Behind him, members of the community and several retired military officers stood in silent solidarity. "Good morning," Elijah began, his voice clear and steady. "I want to start by thanking everyone here today. Those who have stood with me, those who have shared my story, and those who demand accountability. Your support means more than I can express." He paused, scanning the crowd. The silence was heavy, every ear hanging on his words. "What happened to me 2 days ago wasn't an isolated incident," he continued. "It wasn't a case of one bad officer having a bad day. It was the result of a system that has allowed individuals like Officer Randy Thompson to abuse their authority without consequence. A system that has prioritized silence over accountability. And that system has failed us all. Applause rippled through the crowd, but Elijah held up a hand to quiet them. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has been profiled, harassed, or mistreated by those who swore to protect and serve. It's about the trust that has been broken between law enforcement and the communities they are supposed to serve. And it's about the lives that have been destroyed because no one was willing to stand up and say, enough. At that moment, Sarah Martinez stepped out of the police station and stood near the edge of the crowd, her presence drawing murmurs. Elijah noticed her but continued speaking, his tone sharpening. "I've seen the documents," he said. "I've read the complaints. Officer Thompson wasn't an outlier. He was protected, shielded by a department that prioritized its reputation over the safety of its citizens. This isn't just about him. It's about every officer who looked the other way, every superior who dismissed a complaint, every leader who allowed this culture to persist." The crowd erupted in cheers and shouts of agreement, but Elijah's expression remained stoic. He wasn't here for applause. "I am calling for a full, independent investigation into the Jacksonville Police Department," Elijah declared. "I am calling for transparency, for accountability, and for real reform. And I won't stop until we get it." The crowd roared in approval, and Elijah stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding. As he turned to leave, he found himself face to face with Sarah. "Commander Brooks," she said, her voice softer than he expected. "Can we talk?" Elijah studied her for a moment before nodding. They stepped away from the crowd, finding a quieter spot near the edge of the station. Sarah looked nervous, her hands clasped in front of her. "I owe you an apology," she began. "Not just for what happened that day, but for everything that led up to it. You were right. I should have done more. I should have spoken up sooner." Elijah crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't you?" Sarah hesitated, searching for the right words. "Fear," she admitted. "Fear of retaliation. Fear of losing my job. Fear of going against the grain. But that's not an excuse. I let my fear blind me to what was right." Elijah tilted his head slightly. "And what are you going to do about it now?" Sarah straightened her posture, determination flickering in her eyes. "I've already started. I submitted a formal statement to the state attorney's office this morning. I detailed everything I know about Thompson's history and the department's failure to act. I'm also stepping down from my position as captain." Elijah's eyes widened slightly. "You're resigning?" "I'm taking responsibility," Sarah clarified. "And I'm making space for someone who will lead with integrity. But before I go, I'm going to help you get that investigation. Whatever you need, I'll back you." Elijah studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Captain Martinez." "Just Sarah," she said with a faint smile. "I think I've lost the right to that title." They parted ways, and Elijah returned home, exhausted but resolute. He knew the fight was far from over. The investigation would face resistance. The media frenzy would eventually die down, and the systemic change he sought would take years, if not decades. But for the first time, he felt like progress was possible. That evening, as Elijah sat on his porch with Donna, he received an email notification on his phone. It was from an investigative journalist who had obtained additional records on Thompson and other officers with histories of misconduct. The journalist wanted to collaborate, to shine an even brighter light on the corruption within the department. Elijah's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he did. Back at the precinct, Randy Thompson sat alone in a small, windowless room. His badge and gun had been taken, and he was now the subject of not just an internal investigation, but also mounting public outrage. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, Randy realized that he wasn't the untouchable figure he had always believed himself to be. In another room, Chief Harris stared at his own reflection in a glass window. He knew his days as police chief were numbered. The truth about Thompson's file, combined with Elijah's public demands, had set off a chain reaction he couldn't control. The system was crumbling, and for many, that was the first step toward rebuilding something better. 2 months had passed since the incident outside the cafe in Arlington Hills, but the echoes of that day continued to reverberate throughout Jacksonville and far beyond. What began as a single act of injustice had snowballed into something larger, something Elijah Brooks had never anticipated. The city was at a crossroads, grappling with its past and its future. On a crisp November morning, Elijah sat on the stage of the Jacksonville Civic Center. He was flanked by activists, military leaders, and community organizers, all gathered for a public forum on police reform. The room was packed. Hundreds of people filled the seats, while thousands more watched online. It was a pivotal moment, and Elijah knew it. As he adjusted the microphone in front of him, the audience fell silent. He took a moment to look out at the sea of faces, diverse, determined, and hopeful. He recognized some from the protests, others from meetings and community discussions over the past few weeks. Each of them was here for the same reason: to demand change. "Good morning," Elijah began, his deep voice carrying across the room. "Before we start today, I want to take a moment to reflect. 2 months ago, I was a victim of something many people in this country experience every day. I was humiliated, dehumanized, and treated as though my life and my service meant nothing." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But I was fortunate. I survived. Many others who look like me haven't. And it's their voices we need to amplify. Because this isn't just about me. It never was." A wave of applause rolled through the room, but Elijah held up a hand to quiet it. "Since that day, we've seen the city come together in ways I never imagined. We've protested, we've demanded accountability, and we've pushed for reform. And while there's still so much work to do, I want to take a moment to recognize the progress we've made." He gestured to the far end of the stage, where Sarah Martinez stood quietly, her face calm but resolute. Captain Sarah Martinez, someone who was once part of the problem, chose to step forward and take responsibility. She didn't just resign her position. She became one of the loudest advocates for reform within the department. Her courage is a reminder that change begins when we hold ourselves accountable. Sarah nodded slightly, her expression a mixture of humility and gratitude. The audience applauded, and Elijah continued. "Over the past 2 months, a full independent investigation into the Jacksonville Police Department has been launched. Already, it has uncovered decades of misconduct, abuse, and corruption, things that many of us suspected but never had the evidence to prove. And because of this investigation, multiple officers, including Randy Thompson, have been formally charged with misconduct and abuse of power." The mention of Randy's name brought a murmur to the crowd. Elijah's tone didn't waver. Randy Thompson wasn't just one bad officer. He was part of a system that enabled and protected him. But that system is being dismantled piece by piece, starting here in Jacksonville. And that's because of the people in this room, the people watching online, and the people who refuse to stay silent. Elijah's words were met with a standing ovation, but once again he signaled for quiet. "I want to leave you with this," he said, his voice softening. "Real change doesn't happen overnight. It's slow, painful, and often discouraging, but it's possible, and it starts with all of us, holding each other accountable, educating ourselves, and refusing to accept anything less than justice." He stepped back from the microphone as the room erupted into cheers. For the first time in weeks, Elijah allowed himself to smile. It wasn't the end, but it was a step forward. That evening, Elijah returned home to find Donna waiting for him on the porch. She held 2 mugs of coffee, steam curling up into the cool air. He sat down beside her, letting out a tired but contented sigh. "You did good today," Donna said, handing him a mug. "You always know how to move a room." Elijah chuckled softly, taking a sip of the coffee. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone. The community. The people who showed up. This was bigger than me, Donna." She reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "It always is with you. That's what I love about you. But don't forget to take a moment for yourself, too." "I will," he promised, leaning back in his chair. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. It was fleeting, he knew, but it was enough for now. Across town, Sarah Martinez sat in a modest office at her new job. After resigning from the police force, she had been hired as a director of a nonprofit dedicated to police accountability and community relations. It was a role she never expected to find herself in, but one she embraced fully. As she sifted through emails, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Elijah. "Thank you for everything. Keep pushing." Sarah smiled, typing a quick response. "You too. We're just getting started." At the Jacksonville Police Department, the winds of change were undeniable. Chief Harris had been forced to resign after the investigation revealed his role in covering up misconduct. A new chief was brought in, a woman of color from a neighboring city with a reputation for reform. Training programs were overhauled. New oversight committees were formed, and policies around the use of force were rewritten. It wasn't perfect. There was resistance from within, and progress was slow. But for the first time in decades, there was hope. As for Randy Thompson, his life had unraveled completely. He had been fired from the department, stripped of his badge and gun. The charges against him were severe: multiple counts of abuse of power, falsifying reports, and excessive force. He had become a symbol not of authority, but of the very system that so many wanted to dismantle. And while he awaited trial, he was alone, abandoned by the department that once protected him. Months later, Elijah stood in front of his mirror, straightening his tie. He was preparing for another event, this time in Washington, D.C., where he had been invited to speak before a congressional committee on police reform. It was an honor, but more importantly, it was a platform to keep pushing for change. As he adjusted the knot of his tie, Donna appeared in the doorway. "You look good," she said, smiling. "Thanks," he replied. "You think they're ready for me?" Donna chuckled. "Oh, they don't stand a chance." Elijah smiled, kissed her on the cheek, and headed out the door. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, he felt like they were winning. And that was enough.